London, a city of culture, education, diversity and opportunities, which draws people from all over the world. However, London has a dark underbelly, which has seen some of the most shocking crimes committed, which have resonated throughout the UK and in some cases around the world. Two people who were drawn to the opportunities in London were Laurent Bonomo and Gabriel Ferez, both 23 years old and biochemistry students from France, who in June 2008 went on a short research placement in the UK. However, despite only being in London for a short time, neither man will return home. The savagery of their deaths on the 29th of June 2008 would resonate throughout the country. This footage shows them enjoying their time in London, unaware that within 24 hours, both men would be tortured and murdered. This is their killer, Daniel Sonnex, a young but extremely dangerous man who murdered these two innocent young men in horrific fashion, stabbing them, in total, almost 250 times before setting their bodies on fire, leaving a crime scene which shocked even the most hardened detectives. Welcome to Evil Among Us. Daniel Sonnex was born in 1987 into a criminal family in southeast London. Sonnex's family were notorious in the local area for their acts of gratuitous violence and criminality. Bernard, patriarch of the family, has 26 convictions for 47 crimes, including armed robbery, gun and drug offences. Sister Louise has served time for beating a woman with a golf club and glassing a woman in a pub. Older brother Bernie boasts 21 convictions for 34 offences and has served at least 10 prison sentences for offences including aggravated burglary and robbery. On one occasion, whilst in prison awaiting trial for robbery, Bernie called the victims of a pub he robbed and threatened them if they didn't withdraw their statements. Sonnex's whole world from a young age was violence and villainy, and he wished to be like his family, and he began down this path at a young age. At age 16, Sonnex stabbed a boy 3 times in the back and chest after a row. Then, armed with a blank-firing replica handgun, he went on the run before holding the weapon against the head of an innocent woman whilst robbing her and her 3 male friends. A few hours later, while still high on cocaine, Sonnex jumped over the counter for takeaway and pulled out the imitation gun and fired it at 2 employees. Realising the gun was filled with blanks, the employees wrestled Sonnex to the ground and disarmed him, despite him pulling out a large knife. In 2003, for this crime spree, Sonnex was jailed for 8 years, but being incarcerated did nothing to stop him, and during his time in custody, he continued to display persistent violence, including setting fire to his cell, assaulting prisoners, including stabbing an inmate with a pen. In a rare moment of insight, in 2004, Sonnex disclosed to a doctor in prison that in reaction to events, quote, he could kill. Sonnex was denied parole twice and eventually released in February 2008, a 23-year-old, 6'3" ticking time bomb who appeared to have no ability or desire to control his extreme violent outbursts, a man who appeared to have no empathy and whose behaviour was applauded and not condoned by his family and associates, leading to him being given the nickname, quote, Mad Dog. 2 days after being released from prison, he tied up a pregnant woman and her boyfriend, put pillowcases over their heads and threatened them with hammers, knives and even a sword to get them to hand over their money. Luckily, the couple managed to flee after the boyfriend wriggled free from his bindings and raised the alarm. However, his next 2 targets would not be so lucky. On the 29th of June 2008, Daniel Sonnex was in the company of Nigel Farm at age 34, who worked as a decorator, but his life spiralled downwards after his relationship with the mother of his twins broke down. He had drifted between the homes of various associates for several years. This included the Sonnex household, and he developed an addiction to crack cocaine and heroin. Whilst Farmer was present during the murders, and involved, it seems though Sonnex inflicted all or most of the injuries that I'm going to describe. So, this grainy footage shows the 2 men walking in the direction of the flat of Laurent Bonomo and Gabriel Ferez in Sterling Gardens in New Cross, southeast London. They were both 23 years old and biochemistry students in their 3rd year of a master's degree at Polytech Clermont-Ferrand University in France. They had only recently arrived in London and were on a 3-month placement with Imperial College London. These men were academically gifted and had bright futures ahead of them, where they would have likely contributed much to society. 6 days before the murders, Laurent disturbed an intruder at the property who stole a laptop. Whether this was either man is unclear. However, even if it wasn't, potentially they'd already scoped out this property, believing they could break in and take whatever they wanted, or perhaps it was a spur of the moment. Opportunistic. However, what they did to these men was unimaginable. It shocked even the most hardened detectives. Sonnex and Farmer broke in, and they tied up both Laurent and Gabriel and tortured them for approximately the next 3 hours. They were repeatedly stabbed in order to obtain their PIN numbers, and this grainy image from a bus shows one of the men trying to take money from their bank account in the middle of this sickening crime. Laurent and Gabriel were eventually stabbed to death, and an accelerant was poured over their bodies before the place was set ablaze. The fire service was called and the fire put out, and the two men's horrifically charred and mutilated bodies were discovered. The extent of their injuries was nothing short of horrific. Laurent had been stabbed approximately 196 times. The majority of these wounds occurred whilst he was still alive. There were 5 stab wounds to his head, delivered with such force that the blade of the knife came out of the back of his skull. There were at least another 25 stab wounds to the head area, while 14 other wounds penetrated his left lung. A stab wound to the back of Laurent's neck hit his spine, whilst 2 others severed his jugular vein and a main artery, wounds which, if he wasn't already dead by this point, would have proved fatal. Gabriel suffered approximately 47 stab wounds, and his burnt body showed signs of the methods used to restrain both men, with tights being found around their wrists, and the remains of a tablecloth wrapped around his neck. Bruising on his wrists showed that Gabriel had struggled, likely in a desperate attempt to save his life. He received wounds to his face, abdomen, back, and thighs, but it was 2 stab wounds to his heart, which likely quickly led to his death. Both men were determined to have died before their bodies were set on fire. The terror these men must have felt in their last moments is unimaginable, and not something I'd wish on my worst enemy. Both men had families, friends, futures, and all of this was cruelly taken away by these 2 pathetic pieces of shit. And what did they come away with? 2 PlayStation PSP games consoles and £360 in cash, so about £500 total value. This is the price these evil men put on the lives of Laurent and Gabriel. A manhunt quickly began, and the Metropolitan Police issued an e-fit of a man who was seen running from the scene of the crime. On the 7th of July 2008, a badly burnt Nigel Farmer walked into Lewisham Police Station to hand himself in. He was initially told to wait in line, and he said to the person behind the desk, quote, "I've got 3rd-degree fucking burns, and they're not doing anything about it." Do you know what? Fuck you. Like, seriously. When he was dealt with, his main concern was not the fact that he'd been involved in the slaughter of 2 people, but that the police were not giving him medical attention for his injuries, which were caused when he set fire to their bodies. He was promptly arrested. Interviews with Farmer and police inquiries led them to identify Daniel Sonnex as their man, and he was apprehended in Peckham, South East London, approximately 2.5 miles from the scene of the murder, on the 10th of July 2008. Due to him being described as, quote, "extremely dangerous," firearms units were sent in to apprehend him. This video shows his last moments of freedom. Both men pleaded not guilty and went for trial at the Old Bailey in April 2009, and the families of the victims were forced to relive their loved ones' hellish last hours alive. Both men tried to blame the other, but the court was not buying any of their lies, and they were both convicted. On the 4th of January 2009, Nigel Farmer was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum tariff of 35 years in prison. Daniel Sonnex was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum tariff of 40 years in prison. To be clear, this is the amount of time they must serve in prison before they can even apply for parole. However, Sonnex has been back before the court for further acts of violence since this point, including seriously assaulting a prison officer whilst armed with a knife in June 2010. The reason for this attack was that the officer had apparently discovered a, quote, contraption in Sonnex's cell made out of shelves, coat hangers, his mattress and sheets. Sonnex stated in court for this offence, and I'm not joking about this contraption was a, quote, glider, so I could fly from the rooftop over the wall of the prison establishment. Now I'm not entirely clear what's more ridiculous, making a glider from a mattress and coat hangers, or the idea that he believed that no one would notice or question a 6'3" convicted murderer soaring over their heads. Suffice it to say that Sonnex remains in prison and won't see freedom until he's at least in his mid-60s. Whether he'll ever be safe to be released is a question for the parole board, but given the gravity of his crimes and his remorselessness, I'd argue that he will always be a risk to society until the day he departs this world. When talking about the case of Daniel Sonnex, I want to discuss the nature of evil. Is it down to nature or nurture? Basically, are people born evil or do they become evil? This is a debate that's been going on for decades, but I firmly believe that evil is, almost always, something that's created, with the seeds being sown in childhood. When we're born, we are, basically, most of us, a blank slate, trying to make sense of the world. We take our cues from those around us, predominantly our immediate family, and how they act influences how we behave. We use their behaviour to work out how we should act, how we should treat people, what's acceptable, what's unacceptable. If a child is born into a world where they're exposed to serious violence, and they're around people who glorify this type of behaviour, it's no surprise they think this is the way to get what they want, and they don't develop any empathy for anyone else, or any barriers inside their mind which will stop them from committing serious acts of violence, or even killing people. Obviously, this is an oversimplification, but it's not surprising that Sonnex's siblings, growing up in the same household, all appear to have had run-ins with the law. In the case of Sonnex, normal for him was extreme violence, and this appears to have been his way to get what he wanted, to punish people, and to gain the respect of others. I think his behaviour goes further though. The extreme level of violence he was willing to use demonstrates his psychopathy and lack of any real regard for human life. I think that Sonnex felt, in order to get the recognition he was craving, he needed to escalate his behaviour far in excess of any of his siblings or other family members, hence why he turned to murder. But also, Sonnex is, by all accounts, a hulking giant of a man. His two victims appear physically slight, so this offence was characterised by violence far in excess of what was needed to achieve the end result. Instead, I think that Sonnex actually enjoyed the act of killing, stabbing these men over and over again, likely feeling very powerful and a thrill as he took their lives. This also makes me think that he potentially knew that they were there and deliberately went to the property in order to kill them. As is often the case with burglars, if they get disturbed, they tend to run away. Not with Sonnex. He stayed and committed some of the most horrific acts of violence that I think I've ever read about. The takeaway from this is be mindful of what your children are being exposed to, as you probably underestimate the impact it will have on them. Also, professionally, if you want to know why someone offends, always ask them about their childhood, as the key to understanding them and helping them is often found there. Sometimes, through this line of questioning, you can actually work out why someone's committing an offence without even discussing the offence itself. However, regardless of what sort of childhood Daniel Sonnex had, this doesn't excuse his actions. He's clearly an extremely dangerous man, and as I've said, I personally cannot imagine a situation where he would ever be safe to be released. So, what are your thoughts on this case? Do you think Daniel Sonnex was born evil, or became evil due to his family situation? Or was it a combination of both? If you like what I do and want to support the channel, then please consider becoming a channel member. It's $2.99 a month, or around $4. You get early access to videos and an icon next to your name. But more importantly, you help support the channel. Also, you can send a super thanks, which is a one-off donation. Anyway, take care, and I'll see you in the next one.